Okay, welcome to another program in the Merowitz Center's continuing series, Fighting Bigotry and Hatred. Today, in recognition of Black History Month, we are featuring author Stephanie Deutsch. In her book, You Need a Schoolhouse, Stephanie highlights the unique partnership between Booker T. Washington and Julius Rosenwald, who worked to build a network of schools for thousands of African-American children in the segregated South. This afternoon's program is co-sponsored by ADL Heartland, American Jewish Committee, Jewish Community Relations Council of St. Louis, National Council of Jewish Women St. Louis Kaplan Feldman Holocaust Museum, Hadassah St. Louis, and the campaign to create the Julius Rosenwald and Rosenwald Schools National Historic Park. Also here today is Dr. Dorothy Canter, President of the Rosenwald Park Campaign, who will introduce our guest speaker and tell us a little bit about the campaign itself. So thank you, Dorothy.
Thank you, Laura, and thank the Merowitz Center and all the other sponsors of this event. We're very pleased to be able to bring this program to you and to feature Stephanie Deutsch. Stephanie is a co-member of the board with me and a good friend. She's also the editor of our newsletter. We'll tell you a little more about the program, our campaign at the end of the session. The run of the show will be Stephanie will give a presentation about Julius Rosenwald, Booker T. Washington, the nearly 5,000 communities and the partnerships they've formed to build Rosenwald schools in the South. And a little background on Stephanie. I believe you got your undergraduate degree at Tufts, correct?
No.
Okay, well, you got your graduate degree at Harvard. She worked for public television, and then she married David Deutsch. And when she married David Deutsch, and for many years thereafter, she didn't know much about David Deutsch's family. And she came to find out, and she'll tell you more about it in her own words, that David Deutsch is a great-grandson of Julius Rosenwald. And that led her to write her book, You Need a Schoolhouse, Booker T. Washington, Julius Rosenwald, and the Building of Schools for the Segregated South. She has appeared at several Rosenwald conferences that were sponsored by the National Trust for Historic Preservation. She's visited dozens of schools, some of them even with me. And she's an expert on Julius Rosenwald, the Rosenwald schools, and I'll let her begin.
Well, thank you, Dorothy. It's great to be here. And yeah, as Laura said, it is especially appropriate to be having this program in Black History Month. Black History Month, I'm sure many of you know, was founded by a man named Carter Woodson. And Carter Woodson was the second person to get a PhD in history, the second Black person to get a PhD in history from Harvard. And he went on to found what originally was called Negro History Week. And he lived in many places, but for most of his career, he lived in Washington, D.C., in a house that is a National Park Service site. And it's unfortunately closed at the moment. But when it reopens, you will be able to go, if you're in Washington, and see Woodson's office. And behind him on the wall is a portrait of someone he greatly admired, and that person was Julius Rosenwald. Now, how did Julius Rosenwald get connected with Carter Woodson, and how did he become committed to furthering the welfare and the advancement of African Americans? Well, that's the story that, as Dorothy and Laura said, that I got hooked on. I was looking around for a book to write a biography on, and one of my husband's cousins said, well, what about Julius Rosenwald, who was my husband's great-grandfather? And I said, well, I don't know a businessman. I'm not sure that would be interesting. I'm not all that interested in business. But when I did some research and discovered this connection that he had with Booker T. Washington, and when I did some more research and discovered, gosh, I really don't know very much about Booker T. Washington or about the history that led to the creation of the schools, then I was hooked. And so this fascinating story unfolded for me. Julius Rosenwald was a son of German Jewish immigrants who came to this country for the reason immigrants do, for the reason many Jews came in the 19th century, to escape anti-Semitism, to escape lack of opportunity. And as many Jewish shopkeeper in Springfield, Illinois. And so Julius was born in Springfield, Illinois, and he grew up in a house right across the street from Abraham Lincoln's home in Springfield. He worked in his father's store on weekends. He prepared for a bar mitzvah with the small number of other Jewish children in Springfield. His father was the president of the congregation there. Did well in school, but left without graduating from high school to go to New York, where he was apprenticed with his uncles who had branched out from retail. They were now manufacturing men's clothing. And Julius in New York learned every aspect of the clothing business and lived in a boarding house where he met several other people who would become important to him. One was a man named Harry Goldman, who would go on to become half of Goldman Sachs. Julius and his brother Morris decided that they would go out on their own and start their own business to manufacture men's clothing. And they decided they'd do it in Chicago, because if they stayed in New York, they'd be in competition with their uncles. And Springfield was too small, so they moved to Chicago and started a business. And in 1895, Julius had a sort of life-changing opportunity. He had the opportunity to buy into a small, unknown mail order company called Sears Roebuck. And in one of his later interviews, he said it was the business of 5 minutes for him to decide. Yeah, mail order is a business with a future. People out in rural areas didn't have access to stores. It was an opportunity, and so he bought into Sears and partners with Richard Sears, who had founded the company. In 1905, 1906, they decided to expand and build a big modern state-of-the-art plant on Chicago's west side. And to finance it, he turned to his friend Harry Goldman and asked for advice. And Goldman said, rather than taking out a loan, why don't we do a share of stock? We'll do an IPO. So it was the first public investment of that kind. And so pretty much overnight, Julius found himself a very, very, very wealthy man. And so he did what many people would do, suddenly coming into a fortune. He bought a larger house for his family. By then he was married with 5 children. He took the family on a trip to Europe. And I'm really sorry that I don't have my slides, because I have a wonderful slide of them, of the Rosenwalds with the German family, that when they visited in about 1908. But he also started to think seriously about philanthropy. Julius, of course, had been brought up in the tradition and the practice of tzedakah, giving that is based not on, the Christian concept is caritas, charity. Tzedakah is more a righteous act. It is a righteous thing, and it is your responsibility. If you have more than you need, you give to strengthen other people, not as a handout, but as a way to empower them. And so Julius started with Jewish philanthropy in Chicago. But about this time, a couple of things kind of pulled his attention towards the African-American community. And one of these was that in 1908, there was a major race riot in Springfield, Illinois, where he had grown up. And he wasn't living there then, but it was on the front page of the Chicago papers, and it was a very dramatic thing. And this is at the time when American Jews are raising money to send to European victims of pogroms. And Julius begins to kind of make the connection that, my goodness, he said in a speech we look down on Russians because of the way they treat their Jews, but we're doing something that's not totally different here to African American people. He also, about that time, a friend gave him a copy of Up from Slavery, Booker T. Washington's memoir, and he was impressed. Washington at this time was by far the most well-known Black man in America. And some of you have probably read Up from Slavery. You know what a wonderful account it is of his life. He was born in the western part of Virginia, enslaved, not on a grand plantation, but on a small family farm where he and his mother and his sister and brother lived in a little cabin just steps from the master who owned them. One of the stories that he tells in Up from Slavery that I particularly appreciate was how, as a small boy, he had a job, which was to ride on the back of the horse that Laura, the daughter of the slave owner, took to the school where she was a teacher. And then Booker's job was to bring the horse back to work in the fields during the day. And he recounted in Up from Slavery how after Laura had gone into the school, he'd climb down off the horse and go and look in the window. And he saw desks with children with books and maps and a teacher. And he said it looked like paradise because, of course, it was forbidden for slaves. They weren't allowed to learn to read. They couldn't. So in emancipation, of course, this was the thing that was desperately wanted. And Booker T. Washington did manage to get an education. He went to Hampton Institute, which was in Tidewater, Virginia, is now one of the preeminent historically Black colleges, had been founded by the Freedmen's Bureau after the Civil War to educate African Americans to be teachers. And it was a work study kind of thing. And he wrote in Up from Slavery about how his entrance exam was cleaning a classroom. And he had done that kind of work before, and he did it very well. And so he was able to go to Hampton, and he did very well. Another slide, I'm sorry, I can't show you, is the picture of him. He was the graduation speaker for his class. And there's a wonderful picture of him looking both determined and excited, but also anxious and aware that the future will hold challenges. Well, a few years after that, the state of Alabama decided they were going to start a school to educate Black people to become teachers. And so they inquired of the principal of Hampton, what white man could they get to start such a school? And the principal of Hampton replied to them, "I'm sending you Booker T. Washington. I know of no white man who could do better." And so 1881, Booker T. Washington, age 25, goes down to rural Alabama, and he founds Tuskegee, which by the turn of the century, by the end of the 19th century, was one of the biggest educational institutions in the South. It was co-ed, boys and girls educated there together. They were educated in trades, in work, and the school was actually built by the students. They made the bricks right there. They constructed the buildings. They learned carpentry and bricklaying, carpentry, laundry, cooking, and so it was a remarkable place. So Rosenwald, becoming aware of Washington through reading his memoir, when an opportunity comes to meet him, he's coming to Chicago for an anniversary of the YMCA, which both men have supported. He jumps at the opportunity to meet him. And in May of 1911, Julius Rosenwald gave a lunch to introduce Booker T. Washington to sort of civic leaders in Chicago. And the next day, he invited him out to Sears to tour the campus and to, for the two of them to get to know each other better. And this was one of the things that I remember so vividly from doing my research. I started to think about, well, gosh, what was that like? These two men, they were so different. What happened during that time together? And I think one thing that happened was they sort of recognized that they were similar kinds of people. They were both pragmatic, very practical people. They weren't philosophers. They weren't going to sit around and talk about philosophy or ideas. They were going to talk about practical things. how did Rosenwald make Sears work so well? What did Washington need? Well, one thing he said he needed was he right then and there invited Julius, would he join the board of Tuskegee? Well, Julius, being the practical guy he was, said, well, I can't join the board till I've gone down there and I have to see what it's like. So in the fall of 1911, Julius Rosenwald rented a private railroad car and he filled it with family and friends from Chicago. His older son, Lessing, was one of them. His rabbi, Emil Hirsch, was one of them. Jane Addams, who you probably all are familiar with her because of Hull House. Jane Addams was a close friend of his wife, Gussie. She came and they traveled down to Tuskegee, took 2 days to get there. And they spend 3 days on the campus and they meet students, they meet the teachers and the administrators. The final night of their visit, they have a service in the chapel, which was a beautiful building that sadly is no longer standing, but the beautiful building. And one of the things they did at Tuskegee, similar to what the Fisk had been done at Fisk, which was they had a tradition of singing what Washington called plantation songs. These were songs that they had sung during slavery, spirituals and other songs. And it was tremendously moving to the guests from Chicago. You know, there's no radio, there's no records at this time. They've never heard this before. And Rosenwald was moved and he accepted the offer to join the board of Tuskegee and invited Washington to return the visit and come see him in Chicago, which he did. And Dorothy has heard this many times before, but one of the very exciting moments for me in my research was I got to interview Julius Rosenwald's youngest child, William. At the time I had my interview, he was over 90. When Booker T. Washington came to their home in Chicago, Billy, as he was called, was about 8 years old. And he told me in that interview that he remembered when Booker T. Washington came to their house. And I said, gosh, what was that like? What do you remember about it? And he said, well, I don't really remember very much about Booker T. Washington, but what I remember was that he and my father went in my father's office and closed the door and spent a lot of time in there talking. And I wondered what they were talking about. Well, I can't say for sure, but one of the outcomes of that visit was Rosenwald understanding that there was this tremendous thirst for education throughout the South, especially in rural areas where there were simply no schools for Black children. And that in many of these small communities, people were raising money and people had contacted Booker T. Washington saying, we want a school, we want to build a school, we're starting to raise money. They had very little, these people, they were sharecroppers. They didn't have much, but they knew that they wanted schools. And out of those conversations between Washington and Rosenwald came a understanding of a potential partnership. Not Rosenwald giving schools to these communities, but Rosenwald partnering with these communities to build schools. Rosenwald had agreed to give $25,000 to Tuskegee as part of his joining the board. And Washington said, how about we take just a small piece of that, $2,500, and we use it to build some schools to help communities right around Tuskegee build schools. Rosenwald agreed. They built 6 schools, $300 from Rosenwald, $300 raised by the community. And these were the beginning of the program that went on to create, as Dorothy said, over 5,000 schools, shop buildings, and teachers' homes in the time between 1913 and 1932 when the program ended. Rosenwald went down and visited the schools. He was tremendously moved by seeing not just the students, but the whole community turn out to greet him and to thank him, because this was the thing that they wanted more than anything. A man who's a friend of both Dorothy and me is the photographer named Andrew Filer, who a couple of years ago brought out a beautiful book of photographs of Rosenwald schools, and he calls it A Better Life for Their Children, because this was the impetus to create the Rosenwald schools, this strong desire for a better life for their children through the schools. Booker T. Washington died in 1915, so he died shortly after he and Rosenwald met. And Rosenwald then took on the program, set up an office of the Rosenwald Fund in Nashville, Tennessee, and administered the program from there. They created standard plans for about 10 different schools, from the one-room schoolhouse to a 12-teacher brick building that could be sent out to the communities, and building agents who could go and help the communities figure out how to raise the money, how to get the school built. Of the 5,000 schools, in the time that those schools were built, the communities the schools were built to serve actually donated more money than Rosenwald himself. Not a lot more, but the money that was raised in those communities and the donations that were made also of land, of materials, of labor, were slightly more than the money that Rosenwald gave. Part of the genius of the program was that by far the largest amount of money was donated by the public school systems. Public education was mandatory throughout the South at this time, but the public school systems were dividing their money very unequally between, obviously, their white system and their Black system. They were dividing it very unequally so that there was very little, but this was a way that they could come closer to meeting their obligations, but with a less extreme financial investment. So the school program was tremendously successful. And it is said that in the years, the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, even the 50s, a third of the African-American children in the South went through Rosenwald schools. I should add here, when I use the term Rosenwald schools, it's interesting. Julius Rosenwald was a very modest man who did not put his name on things. And so the schools all had their own individual names. A lot of them were biblical names, like the Shiloh School and the Gethsemane School and the Jerusalem School. Some of them were just geographical names named for the place where they were, or the people who had donated the money. The Ridgely School near where I live was a woman named Mary Eliza Ridgely had given the land. And a lot of times, the people who went to the schools, they didn't even know the name Julius Rosenwald. They never heard of Julius Rosenwald. It was an administrative shorthand that the office used, but that many people didn't know. When segregation ended in 1954, Brown versus Board of Education, not the next day, but over the next 10, 15, 20 years, Black schools closed. They were consolidated with white schools, and many Rosenwald schools were just boarded up. Some reverted to the county where they'd been built. Some were sold as private homes. But about 25 years ago, a program started to restore the schools. And a lot of the alumni of the schools began to feel committed to preserving the history of the schools. One of my favorite stories is of the very first Rosenwald school that I visited is in Rappahannock County, Virginia, about an hour and a half from where I live in Washington, D.C. There was a man named Franklin Warner who had gone to this school, and it was a two-teacher school, small two-teacher school. He went off and had his career in Washington, D.C. And then when he retired, he moved back to the county where he had grown up. And it irked him to see that the school that he had loved and that the community had built, the county had turned it into the county dump. And the school was all boarded up, and there were dumpsters in front of it and weeds growing up around it. So he began pestering the county and promoting the idea that this should be preserved, the history should be preserved. About this time, this was at at the end of the last century, the beginning, the aughts, I believe we call it, Lowe's Home Improvement Stores was giving grants to help restore Rosenwald schools. And so one of those was achieved. The school was renovated, the dumpsters were taken away, the weeds were cut down, and it reopened, I think in 2010 as the senior center for Rappahannock County. And some of the people who came to the senior center were actually people who had gone to the school. And the day I visited there, several women who had gone to the school came and they invited me for lunch and talked about what a precious part of their childhood that school had been. Several of them were connected to families that had given the land for the school, that had helped build the school. They had a tradition at the school of soup day. One day every week, one of the parents would bring a big pot of soup, and everyone would have that soup. There was a huge sort of community involvement and community feeling. And as I've gone around and visited different Rosenwald schools, which in the last 20 years, it's been my privilege to do, I've encountered that attitude over and over and over again, that strong community feeling, that strong feeling of pride, that strong feeling of affection for the school. The teachers who taught in Rosenwald schools, these were public school teachers, but they really had a sense of calling. I mean, to them, teaching was not a job, it was a vocation. And encouraging these students, encouraging them to go out, and as one alumna of the Ridgely School always says, go out and be a credit to your race, was one of the things they were told. And the affection for the schools is enormous. The schools had a huge impact. A couple of years ago, two economists from the Federal Reserve in Chicago did a statistical study of the counties that had Rosenwald schools. And they determined, you know, it's fine for me to give anecdotal evidence, the people loved the schools. They determined statistically that the counties that had the most Rosenwald schools, and there were many counties that had 10 or 12 Rosenwald schools, had higher rates of high school graduation, higher rates of going to college, lower rates of incarceration, and higher rates of, by the time the study covered was the years when people were joining the military, and those entrance exams, they had higher scores on all that. So there was actual statistical information that the Rosenwald schools had made a huge difference in outcomes. So it's an extraordinarily positive story, and one that has sort of slipped away. I mean, Dorothy will perhaps talk about how when she saw the documentary about the Rosenwald schools, she said to herself, how is it that I never knew this story? It's not well remembered. And as I say, many of the people who went to the schools didn't even know they were Rosenwald schools. So it's a powerful story that needs to be remembered. It's a source of tremendous pride in the African-American community, and a reminder of the painful history that we've all come through. When I did my research, I have to admit I was extraordinarily ignorant, and I didn't know about the efforts to restrict voting that came with the end of Reconstruction, that became in the beginning of the 20th century, to restrict voting, to separate but equal. And what's extraordinary is that the schools they didn't just give education, but they gave a sense of citizenship. And I really feel that the civil rights movement drew on those generations of people who had been educated and who had come to a sense of pride and a sense of citizenship. One of the things that I've seen in two different schools was alumni reciting the Gettysburg Address which they said was part of to graduate from 8th grade, you had to do that. So I feel like I've talked a long time. I don't know if there are questions or if you want some different aspect of the story told.
Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you. It was always very illuminating. There was one question in the chat about how do you spell Sadaka, which I answered. Why don't I ask you, and two of us have a little conversation, then we'll open it up to the rest of the people here, and either put your questions in the chat or raise your hands. Raise your hands, I'll have to be able to see you. Stephanie, why don't you tell us some of the people who went to Rosenwald schools who contributed to our nation?
Well, it's funny. I just looked down at my notes and thought, oh my goodness, I forgot to say, well, Congressman John Lewis was he went to a Rosenwald school in Alabama, not too far from Tuskegee. Poet Maya Angelou went to a Rosenwald school. If you've read I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, there's a beautiful description in there of her graduation from her Rosenwald school. And she talks about it in the Aviva Kempner documentary. It's beautiful. There was also Victor Dahmer, who was a NAACP activist who was actually assassinated, shot. He went to a Rosenwald school. Nina Simone, singer Nina Simone, went to a Rosenwald school in North Carolina. And this is sort of interesting. Coretta Scott King wrote a couple of different memoirs. In her first memoir, she says that she went to a Rosenwald school. I haven't been able to document that and figure out exactly what that's true, but there were a lot of them. And so those are, oh, and for those of us in Washington, Eugene Robinson, did I get the name right, Dorothy?
Mm-hmm.
Is a well-known columnist who went to a Rosenwald school.
Yeah. Yeah, and a number of these people who weren't as famous as the ones that Stephanie has mentioned, because they were educated, because they were in the South, they joined the civil rights movement and helped lead to the advances that occurred. So it's a powerful story. Stephanie, do you want to tell us a little bit about another program that Rosenwald and the fund carried out? It was an educational program, but it was aimed at people with much more education, people who were grown, most of whom were young, 2/3 of whom were African American. But you want to tell us about the fellowship program a little bit?
Yeah, the fellowship program is fantastic. Starting in 1928, Julius Rosenwald was looking to retire, and he hired someone to run the Rosenwald Fund, and that man's name was Edwin Embry. And one of the new, Embry came from the Rockefeller Foundation. That's where the two men had met. And one of the new programs that Embry introduced was a program of fellowships. And these were envisioned as financial assistance for people, many of them kind of at the beginning of their career, but people who had showed promise, to enable them to complete their education or to get significant experience. And so they founded this program. By the time it ran from 1928 to 1948, some 1,500 people got these fellowships, about 900 of them African American. And the people who got the fellowships, it's like a who's who of African American achievement. Marian Anderson, James Weldon Johnson, Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, Ralph Bunche, who got the Nobel Peace Prize in 1950. It goes on and on and on, to the extent that when I'm reading now, if I come across a person of significant achievement, a Black person of significant achievement in the 30s and 40s, and I always immediately look up, well, was he or she a Rosenwald Fellow? And often they were. Dorothy Porter Wesley, who was for 40 years the librarian at Howard University, 2 Rosenwald Fellowships in library science. A lot of them achieved a high level of visibility and fame. And then a lot of them were just that generation of really solid achievement that made way for so many others. One of my memorable experiences with this was I was giving a talk at a retirement community near where I live in Washington. And at the end of the talk, this distinguished African-American gentleman raised his hand and he said, I think you should talk about the Rosenwald Fellow program. I know about it because I am a Rosenwald Fellow. I was a Rosenwald Fellow. And his name was Samuel Myers, and he had gotten a fellowship in 1948 that allowed him to complete his PhD in economics at Harvard. And he went on to a significant career working in the Johnson administration in the Office of Economic Opportunity, and then being president of Bowie State University. And even more compelling than that, his son is also an economist, and he and I have been in touch, and he wrote a scholarly article about how his father and 4 other, I think, economists in the 30s and 40s who got Rosenwald fellowships really changed the field and opened it up to interest in African-American experience. So it's a phenomenal program. Another one of, you know, sometimes we talk about who's your favorite Rosenwald Fellow. It'd be impossible to say who's your favorite, but one of the more significant ones was Jacob Lawrence. In 1940, Jacob Lawrence is a young artist. He gets a grant that enables him to get a studio where he puts up 60 panels around the walls and he paints them. He wanted to paint them all at the same time so that the colors would all be the same and the look would all be the same. This became the Migration series. And for those of us who live in Washington, we have half those pictures in the Phillips collection here, and half of them are in the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And I remember I first became aware of these paintings when my son's 4th grade class took a field trip to the Phillips collection, and they learned about the Migration series. So it's still, it's imparting history. And speaking of history, John Hope Franklin, the most significant African-American historian, received, I think, 2 Rosenwald fellowships to enable him to complete his work. So it was a very, very significant program.
Now, I'm going to give a little plug for the campaign. I'll tell you a little more about it in a minute, but we have a document on our website, which is rosenwaldpark.org, www.rosenwaldpark.org, and we have a document there on notable Rosenwald Fellows, and in our document we include 96 notable Rosenwald Fellows in all different fields, the arts, science, medicine, social studies, etc. And we would invite you to take a look at that. And also, there were some, 2/3, as I said, of the recipients were African Americans, but 1/3 were white Southerners and others. And among the white Southerners was Woody Guthrie, and also Ralph McGill, who became the editor of the Atlanta Constitution. And all of that you can find in that document on our website. There was one question from Felicia Benzo about the curriculum. Do we have access to the curriculum of any of the schools? I'll take a first crack and then I'll turn it to Stephanie. I'm not aware of the curriculum, but part of the Rosenwald program, and there's much more to this story because he funded buses for children later to go to the schools, and he also had a library program which started after 1928. And there were like recommended reading, and they distributed books mainly for the children in the lower grades, the elementary grades, but also some for the higher grades. The campaign has purchased some of these books. And so there is a list of books that they sent them out first to the African-American schools and then also to white schools. They charged the white schools more for the books than they did for the African-Americans. So I'm not aware of particular, and by the way, most of the schools were small schools. The most commonly built was the 2-teacher school. There were about 1,900 schoolhouses. And then the next most common was the 1-teacher. So most of the schools, at least early on, only went up through the 6th, 7th grade. later with the bigger schools, they went all through high school. But I'll ask Stephanie if she can add to that for Felicia.
It's a great question. The schools were public schools, and so the curriculum was the public school curriculum. At the same time, you've got one teacher in a schoolhouse in the middle of a field somewhere. There's no one looking over her shoulder telling her what to do. So the curriculum was a standard curriculum. One thing I heard over and over and over again is they would get textbooks. They got the hand-me-down textbooks from the white schools. So the textbooks were old. They had, you know, many names written in. They didn't ever get new books, and they noticed that and you know, didn't appreciate that, but it was a standard curriculum. One thing that I think is sort of interesting is that because so many of the schools were small, I mentioned the Scrabble school a couple of times. The Scrabble school was first grade, second grade, third grade, fourth grade, fifth grade, sixth grade, seventh grade in one big area with partitions that they could put up to divide it into two, but one teacher. And one of the things that I hear over and over again is that it was a little bit like a Montessori classroom. The kids learned from each other. There was no way to separate out. So you might be in second grade, but you're overhearing the third grade math lesson, and you're taking it in. There was a very sort of loose in a good sense feeling and way of absorbing what was going on around you.
I'm going to see if I can get share screen to work. And
All right.
see if this comes up. Nope. You are screen sharing. Stop share. Okay, let me try it again. I can't find the screen share either. All right, well, we're not going to waste a lot of time on that. What I was going to do is show you how to get on our website, and or I already told you www.rosenwaldpark.org, and how, if you want information, you can write at info@rosenwaldpark.org.
Dorothy, I can offer to send everyone a follow-up email with that
That'd be
information.
great. That would be great. And then if
Can
they
do that.
want to respond back, then maybe some of them would like to become subscribers. We put out as I mentioned, Stephanie is the editor of our newsletter, and we put out every 2 months a newsletter. The next one will be in April, and it'll be about there'll be something about Booker T. Washington and something about Marian Anderson, so you might want to sign up. So maybe I'll tell you at this, as we're closing down the hour, how I got involved with this. As Stephanie said, I didn't know about Julius Rosenwald. It was September of, I can't take a raise of the hands, but I assume some of you have seen Aviva Kempner's documentary, Rosenwald. If you haven't, it's well worth seeing. It's 90 minutes. And it is that documentary that started this journey to create a national historical park to honor Julius Rosenwald, his legacy, and the impact of the Rosenwald schools. And my husband and I, it was sort of serendipitous, just like the way I met Stephanie. My husband and I wanted to see a movie in 2015, September. Didn't see anything in the weekend section of the newspaper that we liked, but I did spot a little review of the documentary Rosenwald. Neither of us had heard of Julius Rosenwald. In fact, I always figured that Sears was a very waspish company, which it was, by the way, at that time. And we went to see it, and we were both blown away. I turned to him and I said, you know, Jerry, there should be a national park to honor Julius Rosenwald and Rosenwald schools. Now, why did I say this? I knew nothing about Julius Rosenwald until seeing the documentary. I said it because I knew an awful lot about national parks. At that point, I had visited about 300 of our national parks, which are really national treasures, including one you have in St. Louis. and which recently became one of the top 64 now. And so I knew that there was not one national park unit among all of them that, and most of them, by the way, are cultural parks. I mean, we know Grand Canyon and we know Yosemite, Yellowstone, et cetera. But most of them are about history, 2/3 of them. And so I said to my husband, there needs to be a national park for Julius Rosenwald, because I knew that there was no national park at that time, and still currently now, that honors the life and legacy of a Jewish American, and not one that deals with Rosenwald schools. And so that's how the journey began. And not long after, in 2015 and 1, 2, 3, by 2016, I met with people from the National Parks Conservation Association and the National Trust for Historic Preservation, which has done a lot for Rosenwald schools. And we started to plan a path forward. And about the same time, I was having lunch with a friend of mine and mentioned it to him. And he said, "Oh, you've got to meet Stephanie Deutsch. She wrote a book." And his son and Stephanie's son went to school together in Washington. And that's how I met Stephanie. So it's really been, for all of us, serendipity in a way. Stephanie's was more close because it was the family. And somebody said to her, do a book on Julius Rosenwald, which she did, and it's been a very big contribution to helping retrieve his name. If we have a minute, maybe Stephanie, you can tell us why Julius Rosenwald, when he died, it was front page news in the Chicago paper, the New York paper, New York Times, the Chicago Tribune, the New Orleans, Detroit. It was front page news. He was an important person for his business acumen and for his philanthropy. But over the years, he's been largely forgotten. Stephanie, why don't you tell us why that is?
Yeah, that is a very interesting question. Because Dorothy's not alone in never having heard of him. Many people, including people who went to the schools, hadn't heard of him. I think there's a couple of reasons. One was, as I mentioned earlier, Rosenwald was a modest man, and he did not put his name on things. There is one building at the University of Chicago that he donated money for called Rosenwald Hall, but he didn't leave his name on a lot of things. He had given the founding donation for the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago, and the trustees wanted to call it the Rosenwald Museum. And he said, no, you can't call it that. I don't want there to be an implication that my family will support it forever, and take my name off. So they literally had to take his name off the stationery. So he didn't put his name on things, but he also had an unusual attitude towards foundation giving. He did not believe in perpetual endowments. So he set up the Rosenwald Fund to put itself out of business within 25 years of his death. His reason for this was he felt that every generation creates wealth, and the generation that creates the wealth has some understanding of the issues and problems that can be addressed with that generation, but they can't foresee what will happen in 100 years or 200 years. And there will be a Rockefeller Foundation till the end of time, I think, because it's a perpetual endowment. It doesn't spend all its money. It lives off what it can make. That was not Julius's approach. He thought his foundation should spend all its money and then put itself out of business, which it did in 1948. So the name it doesn't exist anymore. And of course, the commercial enterprise he was associated with also didn't have his name. So I think those are the reasons. I wanted to add two little things. One was that I mentioned Edwin Embry, the man who'd become president of the fund. And when he wrote a history of the fund, he called it Investment in People. And I think Dorothy and I share a feeling that this is just a wonderful title, because as a philanthropist, that's what Rosenwald invested in. He invested in children through a magnificent program to build schools. He invested in talented scholars and artists and creative individuals through the fellowships. And it was his unique view, investing in people and a huge return from those people. I also want to say, just going back to Carter Woodson for a minute, the man who founded Negro History Week, which then grew into Black History Month. So much of this history was unknown to me when I was growing up in the 50s, and maybe some of you out there had the same experience. I think I was an adult before I ever heard of Frederick Douglass. We are so grateful to Carter Woodson and grateful to the way he and Rosenwald partnered for creating this institution, this Black History Month, which gives us an opportunity to appreciate, which we can all the time, but the extraordinary importance of this strand of American history. It's our history. It's all of our history. And I think it's so significant that we're studying it, and it's so important that we create this National Park Service site to keep this really valuable and important story alive and make sure that future generations know about it.
Thank you, Stephanie. You started in the beginning, you teamed it up together. I'm going to try one last time to see if I can share the screen. Okay, hooray. So, although I have them in two places, I'm sorry, but this is our website, and this is subscribed to our newsletter. We invite all of you to join us on this journey. We're hoping that by the end of this year, President Biden will proclaim the Julius Rosenwald Schools, the Julius Rosenwald and Rosenwald Schools National Monument. Be great to have you on this journey with us. And again, I want to thank Laura Bryant and the Merowitz Center and all the other organizations that sponsored today's program. It's been a pleasure to be a part of this. Thank you.
May I ask a quick question? I'm
Yes,
sorry.
yes, please go ahead.
I was trying to type it out and couldn't type quickly enough. And so you all are talking, many of you are expressing even in the chat that there's so much information here that you just didn't know. So what can individuals here do to fight against efforts to further obscure information like this through the anti-DEI efforts, anti-CRT efforts, all of those things? What can we be doing in order to make sure that you don't have to be, it's not after you graduate from, college or whatever, that you finally learn about central Black figures in individuals who did this awesome work, such as Julius Rosenwald?
I'll start and then Stephanie can finish.
Okay.
I think tell these stories and refer to them. This journey, it's been, as Stephanie said, very eye-opening, very enlightening, transformative. This story is a very positive story. This is a story of how people of very different backgrounds and cultures partnered. It was Booker T. Washington and Julius Rosenwald. And then after Washington died, suddenly it was Rosenwald and the 5,000 African-American communities. They worked together. They were able to overcome differences, and they could work together as partners to toward a more perfect union, to making this country better. So tell the positive stories, tell the stories you want to tell, and focus on the stories, and don't, in my opinion, don't get involved with all the rest. Stephanie.
Well, what I would say is, it's funny, I refer to my book as the gift that keeps on giving, because it has opened my eyes to so much. And I think we all know that the more you know, the more you know. In other words, by knowing this story about Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington, I learned so much that I didn't know about the situation that caused the need for these schools, I was very ignorant. I didn't know about, I mean, honestly, I didn't really know that there were no schools for Black children in the South. I didn't know that. The more I know, the more I know, the more you have to add on to, the more you become aware of different things. Meeting, for me, the just joy of meeting people who had gone to Rosenwald schools, the alumni of the Rosenwald schools, meeting people my age who had a completely different experience from mine. It's been thrilling. And I think the more you embrace it, the more it gives you, and the more it opens things up to you. As I said about the fellows, once you learn about the fellows, every time I just read the new biography of Martin Luther King Jr. and heard the name L.D. Reddick. I was unaware of Reddick, who wrote the first biography of Martin Luther King. Well, come to find out, he was a Rosenwald fellow. He was part of the story. It's just, it's exciting to learn, to feel more part of the story by learning more.
Heather, are you still there?
She gone?
Yes, I am. I'm here.
Okay,
Okay.
I wanted to know if you felt like your question had been answered, if there was anything else you were looking for. I mean, the only thing I can add to this is that memorializing these stories is obviously incredibly important for us and future generations. And, you know, I salute Stephanie for all her research and Dorothy for all her leadership. And there are many more stories I can tell that need to be told. And thank you for joining us today, because to everyone, because this story is such it's gut-wrenching in one part because of all the challenges, but it's also uplifting because of how people came together and found a way to overcome those challenges.
Yeah. And I will say this, Laura, and maybe this is a nice place to end. Early on, I was interviewed by someone who said to me, what was your big takeaway from the research you did for this book? And I said, my big takeaway was a tremendous respect for African Americans, for the way they made and continue to make a way out of no way. It was moving for me and important for me to learn that and to have a lens that really helped me appreciate that.
Anybody else have anything you want to add? I'm checking screens to see if anybody's, doesn't look like it.
Go ahead. He's Julius Rosenwald certainly helped make our world a better place, doing such a Jewish, wonderful things. What a wonderful program. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you so much for doing this.
Hi.
And wonderful job without the slides.
Yes.
I'm so
Very
sorry.
nice job presenting.
I'm so sorry.
No.
Living in Chicago, so you ought to mention the Rosenwald Museum of Science and Industry, which is living memorial.
I did mention that.
She did mention it, and she mentioned he wouldn't let his name be put on it. And a guy named Griffin, Ken, I think Griffin, either this year or next year, his name is going to be come at the front of the Museum of Science and Industry, because he gave $600 or $700 million for it. Woo. And we have hopes, but we don't know what's going to happen. We have hopes that there will be a large-scale exhibition on Julius Rosenwald and Rosenwald schools in the museum in the near future. But if it happens, you heard it first here. If it doesn't happen,
that's right. You heard it first here. That's right.
If it doesn't happen, forget it.
Well, thank you very much to everyone who made time this afternoon. Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, Dorothy. It was everything I hoped it would be. And I'm just thrilled that you were able to come together and help tell the story. On behalf of everyone at the Merowith Center community, thanks.
Okay. Join us.
Thank you, Laura. Thank
Okay.
you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.